On this Thursday night, a significant moment at the Vatican.
It gave me a real sense of optimism.
After a 2-hour meeting with the Pope, Indigenous leaders emerged with expectations from the Catholic Church, pleading not to be forgotten.
You're not paying attention to us?
Former Afghan interpreters who worked side by side with Canada's military go on a hunger strike.
I cannot see my children, I cannot see my wife.
The new mission to evacuate Mariupol. As Russian forces appear to stall, what is Vladimir Putin's plan? And Russia's invasion rocks the boat.
They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on them.
Tracking the super yachts of Russia's super rich.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
In Vatican City today, this was their moment. Songs of support and strength from a delegation led by the Assembly of First Nations after a long-awaited meeting with the head of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis met them in private for 2 hours, a milestone, they said, in the journey of reconciliation over the Church's role in residential schools. Wilton Littlechild is a survivor and a former commissioner of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He spent 14 years in 3 different residential schools.
Tomorrow is my birthday, and the gift we received today, or I received today, is a good day that tomorrow will be the first day of reconciliation.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Residential schools are closed now, but there is much the Catholic Church still needs to answer for about the terrible legacy they've left. Crystal Goomansingh is in Rome. Crystal, what was the tone of this meeting? What are delegates saying about it?
Donna, there's been a lot of hope expressed here. There's a sense that after hearing from 3 groups of delegates explaining what they endured as children in residential schools, the Pope must have a deeper appreciation, and it's hoped that that will lead to the long-awaited apology. Echoing through the ancient corridors of St. Peter's Square, a traditional First Nations song calling to spirit, a calling to stand and be strong. That is exactly what 3 groups of Métis, Inuit, and First Nations residential school survivors have done as they've met with Pope Francis.
While forgiveness is a personal choice, we cannot ignore the power of an apology and the act of forgiveness that demonstrates compassion, in which we are able to show that we are transforming anger and hurt into a healing process of peace, love, and freedom.
In an effort to show mutual respect and understanding as a part of a journey of healing, Elder Fred Kelly bestowed an Indigenous name on the Pontiff, White Feather. Delegates also presented a number of gifts, including a beaded brooch and an eagle feather. A cradle board, something to hold and look at until the delegates meet His Holiness together on Friday, was also presented. It's meant to have him think about the thousands of children who did not come home from residential schools.
I come from the Peace and Friendship Treaty area, and my dad would always say, you know, there's no peace and we have yet to find our friends. And I think right now the work that we've done and the work of all those who have come before us, you know, we're really setting that path forward.
The 2-hour meeting with the First Nations delegates was the final effort to instill on the Pope the deep and long-lasting wounds inflicted by the residential school system, largely run by the Catholic Church. And the calls for an official apology have been as long and as passionate as the march led through St. Peter's Square.
Our preference is for the Holy Father to come to Canada, apologize on Canadian soil, and do it on one of our territories. That is our hope and wish, and we made that very clear to the Holy Father.
Phil Fontaine says it is looking promising for a papal visit to Canada, and he used his meeting with the Pope to suggest Winnipeg as the first location of that visit. Of course, the city was also the first sharing session by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2010. Donna?
All right, Crystal Goomansingh in Rome tonight, thanks. A 24-hour crisis line is available to support residential school survivors. It's toll-free. You can speak in confidence. The number is 1-800-721-0066. Now to Ukraine. Heavy fighting and shelling is still going on near Kyiv, and it's still difficult getting people out of the worst-hit cities. Ukrainian officials say at least one person was killed when a humanitarian convoy was hit near the northern city of Chernihiv. And in the south, the International Red Cross now says a planned evacuation from the besieged city of Mariupol won't happen until tomorrow for security and logistical reasons. Redmond Shannon reports.
Life in Mariupol is simply about survival. Pavel has survived, but his friend was not so lucky, buried here by a roadside, one of 5,000 deaths in the city, according to the mayor's office. With no power or water, those still here improvise. We cook what we can find, says Victor. Some help is now on its way, though. 45 buses headed towards Mariupol on Thursday.
Behind me there's medicine, there's food, there's hygiene items.
The Red Cross says it has agreements with Moscow to get some people out under a ceasefire on Friday, but some previous evacuation efforts have fallen apart. Russian leader Vladimir Putin issued a decree Thursday. It says that as of Friday, so-called unfriendly nations must buy Russian natural gas in rubles, not euros, or else he will turn off the tap. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said gas contracts clearly state customers can pay in euros or dollars.
Europe pays around $400 million per day for the gas it gets from Russia. And given the current sanctions, Russia cannot stay without these revenues.
This energy expert says Putin's decree allows payments in euros, with Russian banks simply exchanging them for rubles.
I think this is really a face-saving move by the Kremlin.
In other words, Putin can spin this to Russians as a victory. In Washington, another energy move. President Joe Biden looking to reduce war-inflated prices at the pumps by releasing 1 million barrels of U.S. oil reserves a day.
This is a wartime bridge to increase oil supply until production ramps up later this year.
But just how long will the war last? Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky warns that Russian troops are repositioning in the east near the disputed Donbas region, just as his troops make gains in the north. Ukraine says peace talks will resume online on Friday. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
President Biden was asked today whether he thinks Vladimir Putin has been misinformed by his inner circle about Russia's military performance. Here's what he said.
He seems to be self-isolated, and there's some indication that he has fired or put under house arrest some of his advisors. But I don't want to put too much stock in that at this time because we don't have that much hard evidence.
The head of the UK's intelligence service suspects Putin's advisors are afraid to tell him the truth and claim Russian soldiers have refused to carry out orders. It's impossible to know exactly what is going on inside the Kremlin, though as Eric Sorensen reports, history can offer some lessons.
Russian military advances have stalled, but what comes next? Western intelligence says Vladimir Putin may not be fully informed by his own intimidated military, having misjudged the resistance and resolve of the Ukrainians.
It all adds up to the strategic miscalculation that our leaders warned Putin it would be.
But history also suggests Putin may well carry on. Years ago in Chechnya, Russian troops also suffered major setbacks. This Global News report summed up Western thinking in 1999.
The Kremlin's initial boast that victory in Chechnya would be swift and decisive is proving to be a costly miscalculation.
It sounds familiar, but even then a young Vladimir Putin dismissed international condemnation. The war in Chechnya did not end for another 10 years.
Certainly, when you look at Putin's invasions, you see this reckless disregard for human life, for civilian life.
The Russians bombed Chechnya into submission. The devastation in the capital Grozny, the shell-shocked civilians, all acceptable to Putin. In 2016, Russia's bombing campaign in Aleppo, Syria, left utter destruction, and refugees to fend for themselves. What's happening now in Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities is not new. It is brutality we've seen before.
These are the kinds of things that you learn, that you can bomb and use armor, but it's not as effective in Ukraine when you're dealing with a much larger country, a much more determined opposition, with much better weaponry.
When Russia began its invasion 5 weeks ago, it already controlled Crimea and much of the Donbas region of Ukraine. Since then, the Russian military has gained control of areas in the north, close to Kyiv and Kharkiv, and in the south, creating a link between the Donbas and Crimea that has destroyed Mariupol. But Ukrainian forces are contesting many areas. And while Russia has launched attacks all over the country, it is concentrated in the eastern part of Ukraine. Is that Putin's new plan?
Whether he's actually pulling back and going to say, I'm just going to focus on the Donbass and I'm not worried about the rest of the country. I'm a skeptic.
Mistrust for a leader who in the past has met resistance with deception and more firepower. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
A delegation from Ukraine's parliament attended question period in Ottawa today and received a warm welcome. 5 MPs were given a lengthy standing ovation. They're in Ottawa for high-level talks that include the Prime Minister.
I know this can't be an easy trip for you. I know you want to be back there, but what you're doing, what you did in Washington, what you're doing here today really, really matters.
The MPs also met privately with the Deputy Prime Minister. Well, the federal government is committing an additional $50 million in support for Afghanistan to avert what it calls an unprecedented disaster there. But more than 100 Afghan interpreters who worked with the Canadian military are feeling forgotten. And as Abigail Beeman reports, they showed up on Parliament Hill today.
Mr. Trudeau should imagine, if he's here and if his wife is in Afghanistan, what will he do? You know, what will he do for his children? Please do that for our children.
About 100 former Afghanistan interpreters in the cold and rain on a 3-day hunger strike to raise awareness, separated from their families overseas, with heartbreaking story after heartbreaking story.
He's in Turkey right now, hiding there, and the other one is still missing.
I'm super depressed. You're not paying attention to us. We accomplished the mission with you in Afghanistan.
Some have families still in Afghanistan, others fled to a neighboring country. Some say because Canada told them to.
They told me to move your family to a third country. My family is stuck in Pakistan for months, and your visa is about to get expired.
I understand how heartbreaking it is to be separated from family members.
The immigration minister points to some of the complications. Pakistan's exit requirement of an Afghan passport, which could only be issued by the Taliban.
Despite the extraordinary nature of these logistical challenges, we're not wavering in our commitment to do what we can to make good on the promise to bring people here under this special stream that we've created.
To this group, the stream he references is already a broken promise, launched to make it easier for extended families of previously resettled interpreters to come to Canada. Those protesting say of about 300 families who qualify, 0 have arrived here. The department did not confirm numbers by deadline.
That was a horrible job. We work with the front line, we work with the Canadian soldiers side by side. We have been along the missions.
It means like we are in a really beautiful prison. I cannot see my family, I cannot see my children, I cannot see my wife.
Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Money on the mind. Coming up, the priorities for Canadians ahead of next week's federal budget. The Transportation Safety Board says aging brakes, extreme cold, and an inexperienced trainmaster led to a deadly train derailment near the Alberta-BC border 3 years ago. 3 CP rail workers died when the locomotive plummeted off a bridge in February 2019. Investigators found old brake cylinders exposed to temperatures near -30 failed while parked on a steep grade. Canadians will be watching next week's federal budget closely to see how the government plans to ease the cost of living. A new Ipsos poll done for Global News shows the majority of Canadians want help with soaring prices. Our chief political correspondent David Aiken is digging through the details for us.
Well, Donna, previous Trudeau government budgets have really focused on a Build Back Better theme, money to transform society and the world. But the mood has now shifted. Canadians are looking for a budget that eases the strain on their household finances.
What we're seeing is that people have a very clear priority.
and that is dealing with the cost of living.
Ipsos asked 1,500 Canadians to pick 3 top priorities for next week's budget. Measures to help with the high cost of living topped the list, with 53% naming that as a top 3 priority. 45% said lowering taxes is a top priority, and 40% wanted greater investments in healthcare. And while the war in Ukraine has exposed shortcomings in Canada's military readiness, just 11% said Ottawa should spend more on defense.
I think Canadians are not saying that they don't want the government to spend money on defense, but in terms of the priorities that they have, in terms of their relative situation, their personal situation, their day-to-day lives, what's happening to you today matters more than anything else.
This is the first budget since the NDP Liberal Confidence and Supply Agreement, and for that reason, the Trudeau government may be less interested in the budget priorities identified in this Ipsos poll and more interested in the budget priorities of Jagmeet Singh. Donna?
All right, David Aiken, thanks. Canada's carbon tax is going up. Next, what it could mean for you. The federal carbon tax goes up tomorrow. It was brought in to induce changes in behavior of consumers and companies to steer them away from fossil fuels. It's going up 25% to $50 per ton of emissions. Anne Gaviola breaks down what that could mean for you and for the environment.
Even though prices at the pumps have taken a breather this week, there's more sticker shock in store.
The timing couldn't be worse with the massive increase in energy prices.
Ottawa figures the federal carbon tax hike works out to an extra 2.2 cents per litre of gas, bringing the total carbon tax cost to 11 cents per litre for consumers. This will hit the wallets of motorists in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, provinces that don't have their own carbon pricing schemes in place.
And if they do notice it, they won't know for sure whether it's caused by the federal carbon tax or whether it's caused by changes in crude oil prices or wholesale prices or just retail margins.
But these types of increases push up the price of other everyday things, from food to household items. The Bank of Canada estimates the carbon tax as it is now pushes inflation up by just under 0.5%. Ottawa says 4 out of 5 Canadians will end up ahead financially because of rebates claimed through federal taxes. But the parliamentary budget watchdog disagrees, saying most people affected by the carbon tax will see an overall negative economic impact. What it means for you depends on how much money you make and where you live. The lowest income households in Ontario will see a $150 carbon tax benefit this year, while the highest earners will be out more than $1,100. In Alberta, that's $246 back for the lowest income families, while the top earners will be out of pocket nearly $2,000. The carbon tax puts a price on pollution and is designed to incentivize greener choices. That means choosing transit, carpooling, or less commuting can mitigate some of the impact. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Nowhere to sail, nowhere to hide. Next, searching for the super yachts of Russia's elite. Yacht spotting is a thing these days, and it's become even more popular now that so many Russian oligarchs have been sanctioned, freezing their assets, including their multi-million-dollar super yachts. They might prefer to sail under the radar, but as Mike Drolet reports, yacht spotters are on the case.
They say Russian oligarchs are masters in the dark arts of finance, but they're not magicians, and super yachts are just too big and opulent to hide. So there they are, the largest vessels on Earth frozen in place thanks to Russian sanctions. Even in so-called friendly ports, they haven't exactly been welcomed. In Norway, the Ragnar was stuck for a month and a half because no one would sell them fuel. No wonder they're turning off their transponders.
Well, what's happening now is a few of them appear to be turning them off because they don't want to be tracked. And technically this is illegal, but it's very hard to enforce. But a lot of yachts that are associated with naughty people, we haven't had a signal for days, weeks.
Finding the yachts is one thing. Determining who owns them is another, since oligarchs use shell companies to hide their assets. That's where ex-CIA officer Alex Finley says virtual sleuths have stepped in the most millennial of ways, through Instagram.
We've seen that. The younger generation doesn't have the same sense of security, or they didn't get the same security briefing, I think, as the oligarchs did. So we have seen a number of cases where the children or stepchildren or ex-wives of some of these people have taken, like you said, they take photos. Here I am on a yacht. Here I am next to a pool. Here I am doing all these really cool things.
Even so, the vanity of 20-year-olds is likely not enough for a court to determine ownership. And even if that can be proven, seizing property without proof is theft.
If you're going to expropriate people, you have to prove their linkage to criminal or unlawful conduct, and that is something the law will require.
This $850 million ship moored in Italy is believed to be owned by Vladimir Putin himself. If so, and he wants it back, he's looking at a legal battle that could last years.
I'm not sure if you've been in legal proceedings before, but being in a wishy-washy position with no kind of end date, no court date, is actually a good position to be in. And so why not take advantage of that?
Most, if not all, of the oligarchs will likely get their yachts back. Until then, summer on the Med is off. Mike Trelay, Global News, Toronto.
That's Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. On this day when Indigenous leaders met the Pope at the Vatican, we also want to point out it's National Indigenous Languages Day. More than 70 Indigenous languages are spoken across this country. Saul Mamakwa, a member of the Kingfisher Lake First Nation and an Ontario MPP, released a message today about why that matters. We leave you with part of it. Thanks for watching.
Our languages allow us to share our stories about who we are and where we come from. This is where I learned my language. This is where I learned the history of my grandparents, the people, the bays, the islands, the real names of the places around me. Miigwech to everyone working to keep this resource, this way of life safe and living for future generations.